Yeah.
And, maybe it's worth pausing here for a minute to just talk about the archetype herself for perhaps listeners who may have heard of Lilith, but aren't necessarily that familiar with what she is, first on a kind of a mythic level, but then also what she represents in the astrology. So I wonder if you could sort of talk to that a little bit.
Yes. Yeah. Well, so I think what I can say is that when I work with Lilith, I think what I came to understand is that Lilith isn't something that we need to become, it's just something that we need to remember. And she often comes through these very experiences that break us open.
Hmm.
And I think Lilith isn't just personal, but she's systemic. And she lives in these places that we've been conditioned and controlled and silenced, but also in the part of us that knows that that's not the truth. And, Lilith exists across multiple timelines and
Hmm.
cultures and interpretations. And so each of
Sure.
this, tells us something very different about how she's understood or misunderstood. And so
Hmm.
maybe it would be helpful to share a little bit about her. I'm going to call her story instead of history.
Sure. Absolutely.
Um,
By all means.
so her story is, if we go back far enough, you find traces of Lilith-like figures in ancient Mesopotamia.
Hmm.
And so, she's been associated with wind spirits, with night beings, feminine forces that really exist outside of domestication. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, here I'm thinking of the Burnley relief and the Queen is a Knight,
Oh, yes. Yeah.
the winged figure with the bird's claws standing on the lion with a crown. Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Yes. I have that image in front of me, actually, interestingly enough.
Ah,
But yeah. So, of course, these weren't necessarily evil, but they were uncontained. And I
yes.
think historically, anything that's been uncontained has been something societies have tried to control or they've tried to define.
Or demonized.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing, right? There's so many different interpretations of kind of Lilith pre-Christianity. Um,
Hmm.
and
Yes.
I think there's stories about Lilith taking form as part of the Anzu bird, too, this divine storm bird that created destruction. And this was in Sumeria, which is obviously modern
Ah,
Iraq. And this was around like 3000 BCE. And Iraq.
yes. So this is the pre-Babylonian Mesopotamian culture, the
Right,
Sumerians, who we know very little about.
right, right. And, there's also this association with Gilgamesh and the Halupu tree, which was originally planted at this time of creation near the Euphrates River. And, there's the story that Lilith built her house in the middle of this Halupu tree in
Yes.
the Garden of Inanna. And she was joined by this dragon serpent who built its nest at the roots of the tree. And the hero, in quotation marks, arrives on the scene. Gilgamesh arrives on the scenes and slays this dragon. And terrified Lilith tears down her house and then flees to the desert. And
Ah,
and then, of course,
yes.
there's this other story that we hear about Lilith as Inanna's handmaiden, and when Inanna descends into the underworld, it's Lilith who sends the helper and supports the
Ah,
healing of Inanna's sister, Ereshkigal. And then later we see Lilith appear. This is probably the first time that she appears as Adam's wife in the alphabet of Ben Sira. And
mhm.
so in that text, she is Adam's first wife, created equal, but she also refused to submit to
Yes.
Adam. And ultimately, she chose exile over subordination.
Yes.
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 Well, I just wanted to go back a little bit because I mean that's the myth that most people know. But I think what interests me is particularly given your time in Egypt was the Mesopotamian context, if you like, especially given the link to astrology. Because what interested me there, especially around like the Burnley relief, is first of all, how difficult it was, or it is still, for historians to actually say who the Queen of the Night is, for example. And they continue to try to come up with these um, possible explanations for who she might be. And in that sense, I thought it's interesting what you were saying about her defying categorization and so on. So that was one thing. And then the other thing was that certainly the British Museum was talking about her possibly being associated with Ereshkigal, who is sort of the dark twin to Ishtar. And it made me think of in Egyptian cosmology, there's of course Isis and her sister Nephthys,
Yes.
who are dual aspects of the same feminine archetype. And I thought it was very interesting that in the Burnley relief, for example, the Queen of the Night is standing on these two lions that are facing in opposite directions. And it made me think of the archet that you get in Egypt, which is the symbol for the horizon, which
Mm.
is two lions sort of facing either side, which interestingly is associated quite strongly through iconography with Nephthys. So, yes, I mean, it's quite nice to locate Lilith in a pre-Christian context
Yes. Yeah.
before she gets contained and before she gets demonized.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and so getting back to your discovery, I'm wondering what nuggets came out along the way that then led you into this specialization of Lilith through your astrology work.
So I primarily work with the three expressions of Lilith. And each one of these aspects of Lilith holds a different layer to the archetype. And I know that this is a unique lens that it comes through the work of Demetra George also. And so the first aspect of Lilith that I work with is the asteroid Lilith.
Okay.
And
Mhm.
which is an actual celestial body that's located in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, for those who want to know where it lives.
Yes.
And usually, that takes around 4 years to orbit the sun, so it spends a few months in each sign. And I tend to see this lived expression of Lilith as, we experience her in real time through relationships, through identity, through the tangible world. This aspect of Lilith is really where she refuses to submit to Adam. This is the part where the conflict between them is actually very simple. Adam expects her to be beneath him. She refuses. She speaks the secret name of God, and then she leaves. And so this is where themes like independence, rejection,
Mhm.
sexuality, autonomy, begin to play out in our day-to-day life.
Mhm.
And then the second aspect that I work with is the dark moon Lilith. And
Okay.
this is sometimes referred to as the Waldemath moon or ghost moon. So you'll see this in astro.com. And so the first sightings of this, what they called a dust cloud, were around 1618. But then later, there was an astrologer called Sepharl who finally confirmed its existence as per Waldemar.
Oh, I see. So this is Safariel. So Safariel, I think, was a pseudonym, wasn't it, for an astrologist in the Edwardian period? Is that right?
Yeah, so 1918.
Oh, okay. So
They
Edwardian.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's more of a theoretical or shadow point, not necessarily consistently observed because it moves much faster, actually, spending around 10 days in each sign. And this part, the second aspect of Lilith, where she flees to the Red Sea, is really about the grief, the rage, the
Okay.
survival. And so she grieves, she rages, and she processes these losses, this abandonment, this betrayal from God, the things that she's lost as part of her dream with Adam. She wanted this particular life and it never ended up being the way that she thought it would be.
Mhm.
And so she's grieving all of this in this second aspect. And I think this is where we really begin to encounter the deeper unconscious and the exile, the grief, the parts of ourselves that have been pushed so far down that we don't even have conscious access to them anymore.
Mhm.
So this can feel where Lilith is the most hidden and the most lonely, because grief often happens in isolation because society doesn't know how to navigate it or talk about it.
Yes.
And so we can
Yes.
kind of relate to her in that, respect.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Because so many people don't know how to deal with it. They
Yes.
don't know how to sort of what to say to you. So they end up not saying anything. And that in itself becomes, yeah, incredibly alienating.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, and so I think that's part of it, is that she's the part of us that, has never abandoned us, even when we've kind of been rejected. And, I think, and that was definitely my experience, especially in the dynamic of Mark and I were divorced. And so there's this almost kind of bypassing of, well, you weren't together, you know. So there's a lack of
Yes.
bonding that happens because people will take care of you based on the relationship dynamics that you have. And so I remember it being a very kind of lonely experience. And I think Lilith was there. And I think that was the tending. And the interesting part of that is it was a month or so later that my partner Jason suddenly died as well.
Gosh.
So it was almost like she was holding this in between, preemptively allowing me to process the grief that had been and then prepare me for the grief that was coming, unbeknownst to me.
Yes, yes, yes. Gosh.
Yeah. Well, I would just like to pause there, Lisa, to introduce the third aspect of Lilith, which is what that most astrologers work with, which is the true black moon Lilith.
Okay.
And
Okay.
so the true black moon Lilith is the one that kind of exists in, Astro Gold in most of the software. And so the true black moon Lilith is not a physical body, but a mathematical point. It is the apogee of the moon's orbit. And that is the place where the moon is furthest from the earth. And so this runs around a 9-year cycle and spends around, 9 months in each sign. And so I guess to speak to that, the true versus the mean. So the true part, it's more erratic, the unpredictable aspect of Black Moon Lilith.
Okay.
And the mean is more predictable. Well, we know that Lilith is far from predictable. And so I feel like this is the raw essence of Lilith. This is the part of us that moves beyond conditioning, that moves beyond approval. It's almost like she's grieved as much as she can possibly grieve in that second phase of the dark moon. And here's where she's coming into her liberation, right?
Yes.
And the
Yes.
truth does not negotiate.
Absolutely.
So this is kind of what's been very, powerful for me. But I also want to say here that these three aspects of Lilith that we work with, it's not a one and done kind of situation. It's these cycles and seasons that we move through continuously throughout our life. But it is, I guess, a protocol that we can work with of like, okay, where am I refusing this particular thing? Where is the grief having to be processed? And then following that, the liberation of that.
Yes, yes. But I'm just thinking, when you were talking about coming into puberty, I'm just always struck by, one of the sort of aspects of being a teenager is anger and having to come to terms with how to express that kind of shift that we were talking about that's so incongruous,
Mm.
between how you kind of felt as a free, wild child and then suddenly being put into the straitjacket, and at the same time, these hormones surging and having to sort of tame this raw power that comes with that.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. And, I'm even just kind of thinking now about, perimenopause and menopause, we'll go
Yes.
through these cycles and seasons throughout our life, even just part of zooming out as part of these large cycles of how we follow this particular protocol of Lilith, right?
Yes. I mean, to me, it's almost perimenopause is almost the reverse puberty.
Yes.
So you kind of coming into it when you sort of what about 11, 12, and then when you're reaching your perimenopause, you're going out of it again, but it's the same process in reverse.
Yes, it is. And I think, as a teenager, you are, you want to expand, you want to grow. And then you've got these systems that are trying to put you into a box that you don't want to be in. And so I think it's
Yes.
natural, part of that wanting to expand and be free and explore. But of course, this is why Montessori was such a revelation for me, is because
Mm.
it really just allowed you to look at the child as they were, not as you expected them to be. And, my daughter has been raised in Montessori, but I see who she is, this empowered individual that has been very self-directed, very self-inspired to learn everything and anything that she wanted to learn, and how the Montessori system has supported her versus
Mm.
this traditional education where, you're taught as part of a herd and that you're expected to learn the same and that your mind is supposed to receive and process. this information, and it goes against our very nature. And so I think, part of this teenage, this grief, this rage part is like, I'm done. Like, you can't put me in a straitjacket. I'm not who you think I am. But they don't
Yes.
give them the opportunity to, they're already labeled before they've had an opportunity to speak about who they really are. The authenticity is almost squashed.
Yes, and becomes almost split off. So you're allowed to be sort of like Mother Mary or the love object, but you're not allowed to be an object of sexual power,
Mhm.
or express rage or rebellion. So it becomes very split off in the psyche, sort of during the middle bits.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yes, and then taking all this information, so presumably this helped you to develop process of how you work with clients,
Mhm.
in terms of the astrology. So maybe you can just talk to that and have some insights that emerged from that process of working with Lilith in other clients' lives.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting because Lilith wants to come into the chart. Like, she always shows up, even if I'm not intending her, but through the stories of the clients, when we're talking, she just seems to show up. And in the places that are not always comfortable, it's not always the part of ourselves that we've been taught to embrace, but it's incredibly honest. And so the way that I work in my sessions really seems to just validate and confirm and clarify for the clients, like, who they actually are,
Hmm.
the parts of themselves that have just been hidden and suppressed. And then for the first time, they're hearing, you know, this kind of this validation of their lived experiences. And I think we're taught to repel the shadow, anything that hurts or anything that's uncomfortable, like we just push it away. And I think a lot of the work that I've done through Koya, through embodiment, is all about embracing our wholeness. And so
Mm.
I think, Lilith gives us an opportunity to begin to dismantle the stigma that we have around the shadow, because it's part of who we are. If you're a human, you're going to experience hardship, you're going to experience death, you're going to experience these really hard parts of life, and you're going to need a tool to be able to navigate through that. It's unavoidable. So I feel that
Yes.
Lilith really, through my readings at least, really gives us an opportunity to talk about that, to be really honest,
Mm.
and to be seen, to be heard, and to really just experience, this reclamation of our most authentic selves, of who we are, not who we're trying to pretend to be to please somebody else. Right?
Yes, yes, that she's giving permission for
Yeah.
you to feel all those difficult emotions, anger,
Yeah.
abandonment, rejection, how we also deal with those experiences, because that's often where these sort of like the numbing out or the addiction and the distractions sort of come in, don't they?
Yes. Yeah. And the suppression of all of these aspects. Right. And so I think, in the client work that I do, people tend feeling, where they don't belong, or like they're too much or not enough. Worthiness is a huge piece, where their voice isn't safe to express, where they've struggled with boundaries, setting boundaries, with
Hmm.
being seen, even to the point of owning their own desires or their truth, or the way that they want to express themselves, even in
Mm.
relationship. Again, I think there's this societal program that teaches us to self sabotage. I always use this analogy around, if you're on an airplane, in the unlikely event of an emergency, take the oxygen mask and put it on yourself first. But most of us are taught to put the oxygen mask on somebody else,
Yes.
and then we're struggling to breathe because we didn't take care of ourselves first, you know?
Yes, and then wonder why we're angry.
Yes, exactly. Because that people pleasing is grounds for resentment, as is obligation, or
Mm.
doing things out of guilt. So it's really reclaiming our own needs, what we need, meeting them first, so we then have the capacity to meet others where they're at, you know?
Yes, on a more kind of honest level, because everybody else also has those experiences, but they don't feel like they can talk about them either because of these taboos, as you say.
Yeah. So it really begins to open up this conversation within themselves, to begin to explore their life in a way that feels more honest. And I think when we allow these hurt parts of ourselves to be witnessed, that's really where the liberation begins. And it's not about fixing, it's really just about finally acknowledging what's there and allowing it to exist without shame, you know?
And then presumably to integrate as well.
Yeah.